You hear the term poorest countries thrown around all the time, right? But what does that label actually mean? In this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers on global economic disparity. We'll use the latest data to see not just which nations are facing the biggest hurdles, but the powerful reasons why.
But first, that brings up a really fundamental question. When you see a headline ranking the poorest countries in the world, how are economists actually making that call? What's the yardstick they're using to measure this?
So think about it. How on earth do you compare economies as wildly different as, say, the United States and South Sudan? You need one single standardized tool. And the one that economists all turn to is, well, surprisingly straightforward.
Okay, the key metric is called GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, or PPP. I know, it sounds super technical, but here's the simple version. First, you take a country's total economic output, that's its GDP, and you just divide it by the population. Simple enough, but the really crucial step is that PPP adjustment. Think of it this way. $1 in New York City doesn't buy you nearly as much as $1 in, say, rural India. So PPP levels the playing field. It shows us what that income is actually worth right there on the ground.
What's so fascinating about this is how it completely reframes the issue. A country can have a massive economy, a huge economic pie. But if its population is also massive, well then each person's slice of that pie can still be tiny. GDP per capita lets us measure the size of that average slice.
All right, so now that we know the yardstick, let's actually apply it. The data for 2025 paints a pretty stark picture of where economic hardship is most concentrated. But as we go through this list, try to look beyond just the names and the numbers, and look for the underlying story.
Okay, so here's the list. We've got South Sudan, Burundi, the Central African Republic, and as you look down, check out that key factor column. Do you notice the words that keep appearing over and over? Conflict, instability, devastated economy? A really powerful and honestly tragic pattern starts to become clear, and it's not about resources or population alone.
That pattern we just saw, that is not a coincidence. When you really dig into the data for these nations, one factor emerges as the single greatest barrier to economic prosperity, and that factor is conflict.
Let's just take South Sudan, the world's youngest nation. This should be a story of incredible potential, but instead, it's consistently ranked as the poorest. And why? Because its entire existence has been defined by civil war, which has not just stopped development in its tracks, but has actively thrown it into reverse. It's a very similar story in the Central African Republic. The official term is persistent conflict, but what that actually means on the ground is that businesses can't operate, trade routes are completely cut off, and the government is totally unable to provide even basic services. It creates the state of permanent economic paralysis.
For Yemen, the language used is even more brutal. The economy has been devastated and shattered, and that is not an exaggeration. We are talking about the systematic, physical destruction of ports, roads, hospitals, and factories, the very foundations that an economy is built on.
And finally, look at Somalia. Long-standing instability is the key phrase here. When you don't have a stable government for decades, there's no reliable legal system, there are no national infrastructure projects, and there is zero security for any kind of investment. Progress becomes impossible because there's just no foundation to build on.
So the takeaway here is it's just unavoidable. The common thread linking these nations isn't their geography or their culture, it's conflict. Persistent instability creates an environment where economies are physically and socially unable to grow, and it traps entire populations in a vicious cycle of poverty.
But this is where we need to stop and think a little more critically about the data itself. A single number, even one as useful as GDP per capita, it can't possibly tell the whole story. So what are we not seeing?
And this is probably the most critical distinction we have to make. GDP per capita measures the production of things, cars, crops, services. What it absolutely does not measure is human well-being. It can't tell you if a child has access to a doctor, if a community feels safe, or if people are hopeful about their own future. It's an economic snapshot, not a human one.
And that leaves us with a final, vital question. If this number represents the average slice of the economic pie, it says nothing about how that pie is actually distributed. Does one person get half of it while millions are left sharing the crumbs? And is that average slice even big enough to live on? This number is a starting point for sure, but the human story is always, always far more complex.